Welcome to African PM channel. Have you ever wondered why Africa, unlike other continents, remained largely underdeveloped in this 21st century, in spite of having enormous natural resources? Have you ever stopped to wonder if slave trade is commercial in nature, or simply exploitative as history generally paints it? If any of the above related questions pokes your imagination, then sit tight as we dive a little deep into Africa, viz-a-viz her posterity. We start with a little overview of Africa, before and after slave trade. The most glaring historical account of Africa is the slave trade. This hideous event is closely followed by colonialism, both detrimental to their political and economic development. Colonialism will remain a subject of interest as long as Africa remained underdeveloped. Currently, Africa ranks top in poverty index despite handling their natural resources, which they believed developed Europe. Sadly, instead of independence from colonial administrators propping Africa towards self-sufficiency, the reverse is the case. This is vivid with the outrageous number of African youths, willing to risk anything just to migrate to this same Europe, their forefathers dreaded in the era of slave trade. To buttress this irony, the same Europe they blamed for being responsible for forced labor on their ancestors, is now a safe haven, and they migrate to provide cheap labor, which is the idea behind slave trade. African political leaders, on the other hand, are busy signing documents, giving unhindered access to foreign companies to exploit natural resources, thus furthering poverty and underdevelopment of the region, which unfortunately is the goal of colonialism. For this whole topic to make sense, let's dissect slave trade first, and then take up colonialism, which seems to be the big elephant in the room, and see how these two eras impacted Africa. Slave trade. Africans must understand that slave trade is a commercial activity, and as with commercial activities, two parties are always involved. Thus, there must be a buyer and somebody willing to sell before slave trading can be successful. Forced labor, which was the bane of this trade, was not uncommon in the pre-colonial Africa, as intertribal wars were fought amongst ethnic groups and prisoners taken for this sole purpose. Hence, the act of taking people prisoner and forced to labor is not the sole invention of Europe. Africa, Asia, and Europeans have been trading goods and people across the Mediterranean for centuries, but the transatlantic slave trade, which began as early as the 15th century, introduced a system of slavery that was largely commercialized and racialized. Enslaved people were not seen as people, rather as commodities to be bought, sold, and exploited. To put this into trade perspective, Africans were the ones going to capture fellow Africans as commodities to be sold, and Europeans needing labor to plow their newly acquired farms in America came to buy cheap labor. Hence, inasmuch as slavery should be condemned, it's important to point out that Africans are as guilty as the Europeans in this heinous act. Colonialism. Colonialism didn't start with Africa, but ended with Africa. Even Europe witnessed her fair share of colonialism. It's important to note that colonialism is majorly driven by economic benefits, and the norm before globalization is a winner-takes-all policy. Before the Berlin Conference, which partitioned Africa, all roads lead to Rome. Europe witnessed colonialism, but its ability to move past it and strive for development is what should be of note. China, which is now a serious contender in the world power arena, was once colonized. They fought numerous wars with Japan and lost territories, thus, being a formal colony is not an economic or even political death sentence. Africa must learn to stand on her own and protect its economic interest. Asia, at some point in history was classed with Africa, is now way ahead. Other continents seem to be taking a positive stride in terms of economic development, while Africa is still stuck blaming colonialism for all her woes. The twist. Young Africans glorifies migration. To them, it symbolizes a better opportunity, welfare, and even as an elevation in social status. Sadly, 8 out of 10 Africans views migrating to Europe as some sort of achievement. They seem too careless to study Europe development pattern and possibly replicating it back home. It is pertinent, they understand Europe did not develop through migration, rather through radical change in leadership style and ideology. What should Africa or African leaders do differently? Colonialism is a double-edged sword, it has its merit and demerits. From the look of it, the demerits far outweigh judging from a development perspective. Walter Rodney, in his book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, refers to underdevelopment as centuries of exploitation and metropolitan imperialism, principally leading to stalled industrialization and lack of technology. Rodney argued that what was called the development of Africa by the colonialists was a cynical shorthand expression for the intensification of colonial exploitation in Africa to develop capitalist Europe. Hence, to understand how Africa coped with the impact of colonialism, it's best to start with the forces underlying African development. They are far from corruption and bad governance being brandished. It's instead rooted in historic relationships of exploitation within a larger capitalist system, where political and economic strategies on the part of the West are coined to take raw materials for their industrial activities from Asia and Africa. This system is exploitative. It clearly leaves the region with raw material poor, whilst developing the region taking the resources. The world has moved past colonialism and slave trades, and with the formation of the United Nations putting a permanent end to the possibility of it ever happening again. UN serves as a buffer for emerging economies to thrive, without the fear of being attacked or annexed by their powerful neighbors. Africa leveraged this development. As independent African countries jostle for membership in the UN, they go a step further by establishing regional blocs to boost their political and economic policy on the global stage. Unfortunately, this has not helped with the rapid economic development Africa desperately needs to cater for her teeming youths. With the disparity in international trade and purchasing power, capitalism tipped in favor of the developed countries. Capitalism does not favor the weak African economy, thus the spiral migration of African youths leaving behind brain drain on its trail. It is pertinent that Africa embraces technological advancement like the rest of the world, rather than the heavy reliance on divine intervention advertised by religion. If only African youth kickstarts the industrial revolution like Europe, instead of migration, maybe the fortune they seek abroad will be at their doorstep. Africa must see religion from the viewpoint of Europeans and Arabs, hence, understanding why they are eager to export it, but not industrialization. Religion served an important role in international trade. Vague as it sounds, Islam gave the Arabs unhindered access to trade freely in North Africa, while Christianity was a guise by which Western governments justified the exploitation and conquest of African nations. In conclusion, colonialism and slave trade has an economic undertone in common. They are both systematic way of exploiting weaker nations. For Europe to maintain this lopsided economic relation birthed during colonial era, foreign diplomats are sent to ensure favorable trade policies and mitigate military tension with formal colony. Hence, Africans must understand that the foreign aid they constantly receive from Europe as charity is not an economic policy, rather a loophole to keep them dependent. With the rapid industrial development in Europe, it makes sense for Europe to source raw material from Africa that seems aloof of the immense value of the mineral resources they possess, and too conformable to develop militarily. Thus, they are sitting duck waiting to be invaded. Unlike the Vikings, European colonial masters did not kill off the host community, rather they set up a proxy government and employed indirect rule, and Africans oversee the exploitation of their resources. History, they say, always repeat itself, with young Africans helping Europe relive the slavery era with the cheap labor they provide abroad, and contemporary political leaders signing away their rights to natural resource. The future is nothing but gloomy.
Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe to our channel for more of these contents.